Welcome to the Global Philosophy of Religion project at the University of Birmingham, led by Professor Yujin Nagasawa. We at Closer to Truth are pleased to participate. Today, we explore African philosophy of religion. Motsamai Molefe is a senior researcher at the Center for Leadership Ethics at the University of Fort Hare. He specializes in African philosophy, applied ethics, bioethics, and animal ethics, moral philosophy, social and political philosophy. He is the author of An African Philosophy of Personhood, Morality, and Politics. Motsamai, welcome. Let's explore the existence and nature of God in African traditions from a philosophical perspective. And let's start with an overview of African philosophy and theology. I know there are many different traditions, of course, but what are some general principles and maybe some specific examples, briefly?
Thanks for having me. I'm glad to also participate in this great project. I think first things first is the general context within which philosophical inquiry, professional philosophical inquiry emerges. It's the post-colonial context. Post-colonial context. And because the context was dominated by political liberation, much of the development tended to be fixated on ethical theory and political theory. Mm-hmm. It's only recently that considerations relating to religion and questions relating to God and other aspects, metaphysical aspects related to religion are starting to gain some attention. So scholars like Olidopi, Mbiti in the 70s, in a way that's not so much philosophical, but anthropological and cultural, started approaching these questions. It's only much recently that we've seen this kind of philosophical inquisitiveness, philosophical robustness, that the questions about the existence of God and related themes are starting to gain focus.
So as we look at, as you develop a philosophical tradition in African philosophy, I assume you're looking at different parts of Africa because there are a huge number of different categories of people with different traditions. So how do the different African traditions then become susceptible to this kind of philosophical analysis that you're beginning? In fact, you're one of the pioneers.
Look, that's an important question. In fact, it should have been the very first comment I made, is that so with the history of the oversimplification of Africa, it's really important right at the outset to acknowledge the kind of diversity, the kind of plurality, and the kind even complexity that characterizes Africa as a place. The diversity in Africa ranges from different cultures, different tribes, different languages, and so there is that kind of diversity that no one can really dispute as a matter of fact. But that shouldn't deter us from appreciating the fact that an empirical observation that as much as there is this diversity, there seems to be a thread, common thread that unifies Africa in certain ways, particularly Africa below the Sahara. There are certain common themes. There might be, in terms of detail, there might be differences, but common themes that emerge. For example, one of the uncontroversial aspect that is common among most sub-Saharan communities is just the belief in ancestors, that when people die, they become these spiritual beings that continue living. I've not met any tribe below the Sahara that doesn't quite believe in something like that. So as much as there's this diversity, it does not dispel the possibility of themes that are shared in common.
So this is a very important point to have as a foundation, that there are these themes in common. Ancestor existence is a very, very interesting one. And then as you then look finer into the differences between the tribes and the traditions, there are subtle differences. And I think to understand both of those is critical to understand the development of African philosophy.
Indeed, indeed, but also what it does, what these common themes, what they allow us a platform from which to start to do our philosophical work. So you look, what is a central insight that can be gleaned from this particular belief, and what are its philosophical implications? And then from there we can move to cross-cultural comparisons, right? So for example, where in the Catholic tradition you might have people becoming saints, or you might talk of angels. In the African religion, you don't find saints, you don't find angels. What you do find, you find ancestors, right? So then that allows us to say, how do we compare the two? What are the implications for this, for lived life? And yeah.
So this is very good as our methodology for beginning, and I think it's so important for everyone to understand this because, as you said, African traditions have not been in the mainstream of philosophical thinking in the West, and that's one of the purposes of the Global Philosophy of Religion project to bring a true global understanding to the philosophy of religion. So I like the idea of looking for these general principles, then looking for specific differences, then to understand African philosophy in its own context, and then we can compare it to the philosophy of other religions in other areas. And I think your example of ancestors in Africa versus saints or angels in other traditions is an excellent point to see differences, to see commonalities as well as compare differences. So I remember from the last conversation we had in the panel on African religions, where you represented it, you made a very interesting point that I want to now follow up. I was frustrated I couldn't do it then. In that you said the family is an extremely important structure in African traditions, and whereas other traditions may have a different focus about God or something, but the family is so important. So I want to begin, as we want to focus on God. So because the family is so important, what can we infer about God in African philosophy because of the importance of the family?
So one of the so the importance of the family in African tradition touches almost upon every important theme. So if you look into how society is organized, is imagined in terms of the family. If you look into some African conception of the cosmology of the world, it takes a form of a mother and a father. So the family, plays an important role in thinking about almost everything. It's the very heart of morality as well is centered around the family and the relationships of care, love, and solidarity. So the family in that sense is a very central theme in African philosophy, but specifically in relation to God, is that religion is something that you're born into. Religion, you inherit it in the family. Right? So the idea of God is not something that you pick up from a pulpit. It's not something that you pick up in a church. It's something that you inherit directly from your mother and the family at large who's raising you. So that is why in African tradition, there's this saying that religion, God is not even supposed to be taught because it's so obvious. And to make sense of that obviousness is because there's a sociological structure, specifically the family, that really introduces you to God. And this kind of introduction is quite powerful in the sense that God is revealed to you through the lived experiences of people that are most important and dear to you. So that's the very first facet of it. But another facet of it is that the family is understood it has three dimensions. The family, it has three dimensions. So on the one hand, it's those people that are there, your mother, your father, it's an extended family, your uncles, these are people that are empirical, you can see, you can talk to them. That's one part of the family. The other part of the family, it's a group called the unborn, right? People who are still on their way.
Oh.
They're still on their way. There's that community of the unborn, right? And this has got implications about how to think about ethical questions of the beginning of life, things like abortion, stem cell research. Yeah. And then there's another community, what we call ancestors or the living dead. So that's the community. And all of these are aware of the history of the ancestors. They are concerned about the future of the unborn. And from that history and the ancestors are directly connected to God. So your belief in God is rooted directly in the relationship you have with your actually living empirical beings, me and you, and it's also connected with the ancestors. And the ancestors, their role is important because they're the ones who've got direct access to God, direct access to God. And the other, philosophical issues we could deal with there, with the question of direct access to God. So two important themes there. So there's a question of the hiddenness of God. So in the African religion, to deal with the hiddenness of God, it's dealt with directly through the ancestors. So the ancestors is the most, it's a medium through which we come into contact with God. So there's a question of the hiddenness of God mediated through the ancestors. And there's a question also of revelation, that African religion is not a revealed religion. So you don't have prophets, you don't have scripture. So the family, in a way, becomes a form of revelation. That archive of experience, that archive of the oral tradition becomes a repository through which you hear stories, you have tales of how people, interacted with the Almighty or the supernatural. So there are those issues which I find them exciting as you look into the family and its relationship with God and what we can infer about God.
So this experiential way of thinking about God is very different because in the West, we have had this long tradition of arguments for and against the existence of God. And this goes, way back to Greek civilization through the Middle Ages, driven by Catholic philosophy and certainly in our present day. And so you don't find then in Africa these kinds of arguments for and against God with very specific ways of thinking, but rather this experiential sense of the family, both with current family, ancestors, and then the unborn, which is a very comprehensive experience. Is that sort of right?
That's one of the things that really struck me when I was doing my first year at varsity. For the first time, I encountered the 5 ways, for Queen. I'm saying, there's a culture that has really spent centuries thinking about the existence of God. And even as a young boy, I've never really doubted that there is God, right? Until, in my mind, it took a cultural form, of be it African or be it Christianity or be it Islam. So, but you don't find systematic accounts that seek to, give us reasons for the existence of God. You really don't find them. If you find them, as enthymemes, they are implicit. And what's really interesting about them is that some of them, they will give you a sense of the cosmological argument, or give you the sense of the design argument. And that seems to be the dominant argument for the existence of God, the design argument. So you'll find inferences and implications but there is no, I'm not aware of it at least, an intellectual culture, of thinkers who said and say, I want to convince you that God exists, I want to convince that God exists. I mean, in a way, in the African tradition, that comes across as arrogant. That comes across as arrogant to want to come with an argument for the existence of God, right? So I mean, also it's the kind of cultural curiosities you find, they're quite different, right? So the authority of the family seems to settle the matter, but maybe in an individualistic culture where you have to demonstrate to other individuals and to your society that I've got a reason to believe this. That might come out as something very important. But in a context where you are secured in the family, it seems those kinds of considerations were not important. But philosophers today, where we are, we're starting to ask those kinds of questions. What kind of arguments can we deploy to deal with our experience that there is such a being as God? How might we want to deal with that?
You have an important paper with Thaddeus Metz that's entitled Traditional African Religion as a Neglected Form of Monotheism. So why monotheism and why neglected?
Thanks. So influential religions around the globe tend to take monotheism as a point of departure, and people tend to assume that this is just a standard feature only of Western, philosophies of religion. But it struck me, and it struck Thad, that myself as a cultural insider and as a philosopher, that when you look into the names used to refer to God in the local languages, they are never in plural, it's singular, they presuppose a singular being, right? So my name is Motsamai. So the prefix Mo presupposes singular and refers to a person. So you say Motsamai. So two things are presupposed there. One is a person and two is singular, right? And the name in the language of my name, Sotho, for God is Mudimu, Dimu. So it's singular and is a person, right? So, and this is just one language. But if you look into many other languages, if you look into Zulu, Xhosa, the Nguni languages, the Sotho languages, that limited empirical data struck me when I was doing my PhD to say, but you're imagining a singular being, right? A singular person, and so that was the first form of evidence. The second form of evidence was that when I started looking into literature in theology, is that as much as there were differences, but the theme of monotheism, which sees the singular being with particular features that describes and explains what constitutes him, were also a feature of much of African religion. This person's a creator, this person's a sustainer, this person is a provider, he's omnipotent, and those features of this single being were a feature of African religion. So in terms of monotheism, for me, those were two sorts of evidences. On the one hand, you have a being that is comparable to what in other cultures is captured in terms of monotheism. So it means that also in this part of the world, we do have an account of that conceives of religion and God in terms of monotheism. Neglected precisely because Africa is so broad and is so vast, and often you hear people talking of divinities, talking of ancestors, particularly divinities. People assumed that there was a plurality of gods instead of a single God. But that mistaken interpretation is a function of not understanding the ontological frame that captures African religion. If I may, just to give you a rough frame. So the structure of African ontology takes a hierarchical form. This hierarchy has about 5 or 6 elements. At the top of the hierarchy is God, single being God. And then below the hierarchy, you find the spiritual community, where it will be largely ancestors and other spiritual entities. And at the center of the hierarchy is human beings. So often than not, when people then confused the second element of the hierarchy for the first element of the hierarchy. So right at the top, you've got a supreme being who's God. And between the supreme being and the human community, you've got these divinities in the form of ancestors, in the form of ghosts, in the form of spirits, and so forth and so forth and so on. So that's where the confusion was, the middle category, which is also interesting for theological analysis, but it's not, it shouldn't be used to eclipse us from the monotheistic orientation of African religions.
Yeah, very important point. Just curious, you said there are other levels, the human in the middle. What's
Yes, so in a sense, so below then you've got,
what's below?
So below, I'm sorry, we tend to be very anthropocentric. So below you've got animals, the animal community.
Okay.
And below the animal community, you've got the vegetal community.
Okay.
And below the vegetal community, you have the inanimate community. And all of these are communities. Okay. And what's interesting also, maybe for the sake of detail to appreciate this, these distinctions, they're important ontologically, but the best way to think about them is not to think of them, analytically, is to think of it holistically, right? These are, you think of them as intertwined, you think of them as interconnected, right? So there is that flux of complex interrelations between these entities, right? Yeah, but I don't have time to get into the details, but.
So that's fine. I just wanted to have the whole picture, and that makes sense. And the confusion you're talking about is entirely understandable. And your explanation is very clear that it's really monotheistic. It's just that middle level that has been misinterpreted because in the Western religions, they also have a middle level with angels or whatever spiritual beings, but they don't think of that as a polytheistic religion. So that's very good. Continuing.
And if I may just interject, and part of the confusion is that because that these two things that we highlight in the paper, there's a sense in which God is too distant, and there's a sense in which God is too big. And that is why often than not, you will not find people that are addressing God directly. And then it's easy to think that, oh, these people are worshiping many spirits. It's because there is that, reverence for God. There is that understanding God is too big. We need a mediator. Hence, often, entities that are invoked is the middle layer, not because they are worshipped. That's another misconception. Not because they are worshipped, but because they are understood for their mediation role, because of the grandness, because of the transcendental nature of God. I'm using the word transcendental here with this because God is immanent in this ontology. So God is here. God is here. It's part of this world. There's no division between heaven and earth. There's no such a place as hell. Everything is contained. So there's characterized by metaphysical monism. Right? Everything is here. Yeah. I just thought where the confusion might be.
Yeah. Look, I think this is an extremely important point, and it's indeed one of the highlights here. In terms of the existence of God, do African traditions ever deal with the problem of evil, which Western religions have to deal with because they define God in a certain way, omnipotent, omniscient, and all good, and then we have the enormity of evil. So that becomes a problem for religious believers from a philosophical point of view in the West. Do you ever have that problem in African religion? Obviously, there's as much evil in Africa as any other place in the world. Nobody has nobody has an exclusive on non-evil.
Well, thanks for that. Certainly, we do have a problem of evil, and I think it might even be worse in Africa than other parts of the world. But the way it's handled. It's interesting because, look, I must admit that there's not a lot of literature on this. From African philosophy, I've read just one piece from a guy called Kwame Cheche, writes a piece dealing with this problem. And the way he settles it, I'm still thinking about this problem. I'm working on a paper where I'm trying to think about it. But the way he settles it, it's that evil can only be associated with creation, right? Can be associated with creation, and chief in creation is the focus on agency, human agents in particular. That's where you can find evil. But what I'm working on, which is interesting, then is how we think about this evil, which maybe is a theme we're going to come back to. That the defining feature of God and the most important ontological feature in the world, the essence of being, the metaphysical category, is the idea of vitality. So if you think what is the distinguishing feature of God, is this thing called vitality or life force, or even life. So evil in this particular thinking, so by life force or vitality, it's a spiritual energy that originates and emanates from God. It defines the essence of who God is. And practically, to think about it, it is associated with liveliness, robustness, synthesis, health, productivity, and things like that, right? Productivity and things like that. So the negative of vitality is what we call moral death, or the deterioration of vitality, which is characterized by death, passivity, a lack of productivity, and things like that. So evil is a function of human agents, in part, failing to live in ways that produce more vitality. So there's a teleological frame to this, in a sense that so growing one's vitality, growing life force is the kind of thing that you can grow, and its growth is causally connected with perfection, and its depreciation or its decay, it's associated with imperfection. And so evil comes as a result of individuals, messing up their vitality.
Okay. In African traditions, what is the importance of religious or mystical experiences in terms of accessing God?
Well, before I come to that, there's a point that I forgot to mention,
yeah,
which is related to the first one. So what's interesting, so the problem of evil in the Western tradition is associated with sin. So we're in this mess, particularly in the Christian, we're in this mess because someone sinned.
Right.
So free will is central in that. What I find very interesting, which is something that's not been explored in African traditions, that there is no category of sin. As you know, in Christian literature, sin appears both as a verb, as a noun. You know, when you read Romans 5:12, by one man sin entered the world. You know, sin is a thing, and sin also is a transgression of a law, right? So if you study, you know, hamartiology in Christian theology. But what's interesting here, that the category of sin as a thing that's in the world, you know, it doesn't exist in African thought. What you have is sin as a moral category. It's evil as a moral category. Evil as a moral category. So it's a very moralistic religion, in a sense, you know, and that is why you don't need salvation. You just need to be corrected to be able to live a moral life. As opposed to when there's a sin that's a thing, you need a savior to die for you, to save you from this thing that has power over you. So I just thought that has got implications.
It's a very important point, and I know that you have stressed in your philosophical work morality as a central part of African philosophy that you focused on. And so take that further. By such a significant focus on morality as opposed to sin, which I didn't realize, that's fascinating. How does that reflect on the nature or traits of God from an African perspective, if morality is such a central point?
What is interesting here is just the fact that it's how the two, it's the centrality of agency. And by agency here, it's agency in terms of the development of vitality. Agency as an expression, as a realization, as a growth of vitality. That what you find interesting about, it's a God who believes, the idea that God believes that he has created beings that are able to self-correct, beings who are able to self-direct, beings who can make the world what it's supposed to be, which is very interesting, So there's a kind of independence in the way in the way that the relationship between God and man is imagined, right? That as much as God is involved, but on issues of how human beings are to live, there's this kind of independence that is, I think, is so central that for you to be the kind of a thing that you ought to be, for the world to be the kind of a place that it ought to be, it is left in the domain of humanity to make that kind of intervention, which I think has interesting implications about how to think about the question of God, the question of control, and the place of human beings in the world that he has created. And which is, I think, is something that really needs to be explored. Really needs to explore. Because the idea is this: there is no God who's coming to save you. And you understand, there's no God who's coming to save you. But you've got this spiritual energy that, if properly harnessed and developed, can improve your life, can improve life of the world. And God has not neglected you. You are neglecting to properly develop this, which is completely different from a religion that says there's someone who's coming to really help you.
It's also different from the karma or the reincarnation of Eastern religions. That's a different,
yes,
a different structure entirely. So as a product of this morality that you are building yourself, are there any implications for your post-life experience? It's not a salvation; nobody's saving you. But if everybody's going to become an ancestor and a spiritual being, is there any impact on our future life based on our current life and the morality that we're achieving?
So it seems that morality is your ticket to the afterlife. So morality is your ticket to the afterlife. So the progression seems to be: you are born and you are socialized and you are taught all of these things, and then the goal of the project of the human existence and human life, it's growing yourself to realize the true destiny of your humanity by intensifying your vitality, as Placide Tempels, informs us. So if you succeed in that project, you acquire what in my work and in African philosophy called personhood. You become a person, right? So that distinction between being human and a person. So the one category is ontological, biological, ontological. The other category is moral. You become a person. So though everyone is human, not everyone is a person. And if you die as a person, then you translate it into ancestor, right? You're translated into an ancestor. That's the afterlife, right? But this is not in heaven. This is here on earth, right? So your goal is not to leave planet Earth. Your goal is to take a different form of life in planet Earth, right? So there's no hope for singing and all of those kinds of other things, So you are here. But now this afterlife, it's a life also of activity, and because now you've got responsibility to connect your family with God, and you've got responsibility to bless, support, and also censure your family members when they deviate from taboos, customs, and all of that. But even in this afterlife, this got interesting implications. There's no such a thing as eternal life. Not such a thing as eternal life, right? So for example, scholars make a distinction between personal immortality and collective immortality. So personal immortality is when your family members, remember, each family has got their own ancestors. When your family members still remember you, it is in that remembrance that you enjoy personal immortality, because they refer you by name, and they prepare food for you. They make rituals for you. And in that state, you enjoy what is called personal immortality. But when generations down the line, you disappear from that relationship of remembrance, then you join collective immortality. In that state of collective immortality, it could as easily be annihilation, or you could just live as something in the universe, but you're no longer connected with the family in that way. And what's very significant here for comparison is the fact that meaning seems to inhere in continued relationships with your family. Meaning seems to, and by meaning here, it could even be deep. Even existence, in a sense, is a function essential of these relationships. So you, as a living human being, empirical human being, you get into these relationships, you grow your vitality, you gain your moral status of being an ancestor or the living dead, of being a moral exemplar, and you pass away, you change your state, you become a living dead or an ancestor, and you guide your family and you get connected through relationships. And then those relationships wane, others develop in the family, and that's it. And that's it.
Okay. What do religious experiences or mystical experiences in African traditions have to do with how people get to know God? Is that important?
Well, it's not that important.
Okay, well that's important to know.
Yes, I'm saying yes. I know it's. I'm saying it's not that important.
Okay.
It's not that important.
The
work.
Very important.
So
it's the whole life experience, is what you're telling me.
Really, and maybe 2 points here are crucial to capture. Two points are crucial. One is that point about the lived experience, right? And this is a very important point to appreciate. Lived experience in that God, in a sense, is not compartmentalized into an institution with which, then you have churches and entire bureaucracy associated with them. And the function of a church in a society is saying we are going to worship God. That kind of compartmentalization, it's very foreign, but I know it's dominant now in practice in Africa because of, but in traditional religion, God is not compartmentalized like that. God is a feature of our day-to-day existence. Day-to-day existence. So he's not compartmentalized in that sense. So when I'm engaging my ancestors, I'm engaging God. When I'm working in the field, I'm engaging God, right? And the thought need not be uppermost that I'm engaging God. It's so normal, it's so practical. That is not something that, but when, yeah. So that's just one thought that I think needs to be explored, right? And I find it to be very liberating, right? You don't need elaborate rituals of how to think about God. You don't need, God is part of your daily life, right? And he doesn't disturb you from living your life where you have to stop and pay attention to him, right? I'm sorry.
I like that.
I'm sorry, I don't want to suggest.
You may find a new adherent in me. I may look at this very seriously. I like that approach.
Particularly if you've been disturbed for many years. And the second component, which I find interesting, is just that there was a group of people who were trained to be able to connect with God in that way, right? To be able to decipher spiritual messages, to connect with answers. It was a group of people. It was a specialized area, right? So you find that, and it was left to them. It was left to them. But also we can't take away from the fact that dreams also feature in culturally and empirically, but there were people who were trained to deal with dreams, but they would, dreams, ancestors would appear, to people and all of that, right? But that kind of experience is not generally essential to day-to-day living.
Okay. We ask a general question about God to all of the different religions we're focusing on, and it's an important one in that is God a person, a personal being with personhood features like awareness, intent, will? That's the general question that we ask. And what you said earlier was to me very interesting, because you said that the same word that begins your name, more, is also applied to God, and it's applied to you. So that means one, but the fact that it's the same name that is used on God that's used on you indicates that in traditional African religion, that God is indeed a person. Is that right?
Yes, I mean, yes, we think of God as a person, the sense in which he's a person, he's got personal features, yeah. So you'll find that in one tradition, in one culture here in South Africa, they would talk of a one-handed God, that God has one hand. He doesn't need to. He's so powerful that doesn't need two hands, right? So you get. So the point is that God has these features, right? Of he's a person. He's intentional. He's got a mind. Yeah. So he's a person in that sense.
So let's go on to other attributes, because as you know, in the Western tradition, they have what's called perfect being theology, that God is all powerful, omnipotent, omniscient, knows everything, omnipresent, is everywhere, omnibenevolent, is totally good, with these sometimes other characteristics of timelessness or immutability and passivity. Um, in African traditions, the idea that God has one hand because he's so strong is sort of an analog of omnipotence
Yes, it's an
in a
analog of
very
omnipotence.
in a very practical manner. So how do you relate these other kinds of characteristics that occur in philosophy of religion in the West to African traditions?
But to be honest, this is not a question that I've really invested myself much on. But just from prima facie engagement with the literature, you find the idea that God is eternal. God is eternal. The idea that he's some of the analogies used to describe God as a father, as a mother, with the underlying idea that he's a provider. He's benevolent. So you find those associations. One interesting one which is got interesting implication to think about perfection, and it's God as a creator, because if you take the cosmological argument, one of the implications of the cosmological argument is this idea that God created the planet, the earth, heaven and the earth, or however way you may style that, ex nihilo, right? There was no pre-existent matter, that so in that sense, he's a creator, But in the African tradition, what's interesting is that God is understood as a creator, not in the sense that he created ex nihilo, but in the sense that he created from existing matter, created from existing matter. There was pre-existing matter. So he's a creator in the sense that he formed, he was a molder, if you will. Just molded the earth and gave it a teleological orientation of sorts. Right? And you find very interesting debates then. The question is that which God is better? The one who creates from nothing? Which God is really superior? What captures omnipotence better? A God that creates, ex nihilo, or the God who creates ex materia, right? So those are very interesting philosophical debates, and I'm sure as philosophers we'll reflect on these issues. But conceptually and ontologically in African tradition, the notion of existence, that concept of existence already presupposes a place. And that's why Africans insist that so if you just do a basic linguistic analysis, is that the minute you talk of existence, you can't talk of existence without necessarily, implying a place. So this has got interesting things about the metaphysics of nothing, the metaphysics of nothing. Right? So in African religion, the idea of nothing seems to be conceptually and metaphysically problematic. So it might just be a limitation of language. Or it might just be a serious ontological problem. But these are issues, to be quite frank, that I have not invested my intellectual energies on.
Well, there's a lot more to do, and you have a long career ahead of you, and we look forward to that. The God that we're talking about, does that God intervene in human affairs on Earth? And if so, how does that God do it? Does it violate the laws of nature, or what is the process by which God would interact with with human activities, whether on an individual basis or on a group basis?
Thanks. So, well, the general picture is it's a God who's in some sense involved, who's in some sense involved, in some sense involved. Excuse me, in some sense involved, and to properly appreciate this, and for me, this is my conviction, and it's just to understand that this God, in the very first place, is not in heaven, or is not in a separate place from us. He is immanent. He is part of the world. And as part of the world, he takes interest on affairs of the world. And he intervenes in the world. In other words, if human beings deviate from the purpose, of vitality, he then responds in a way that deters that. So when there's for example, when there's a drought, it could be interpreted to say that God is not happy, and that is connected with reduction of vitality, that our leaders who possess generally higher levels, and our families and community has lost so much vitality that the planet is responding and God is really punishing us, right? And if people do well, God, then there will be so much productivity, there will be so much fertility, there will be so much growth. So there's a sense in which God is involved in the affairs of the world. But also what's very interesting also to note is that there's a sense in which also he is not at the center of things. He's really at the background. He intervenes when necessary. At the center of things, the very anthropocentric picture is the theater of agency in the world. It's living beings, actual empiricals, beings like me and you. It seems that God intervenes when we've really been wayward. But at the center of the theater of focus is what is called the visible community, human community, who have power to make things better or worse off in the world. And then God intervenes here and there.
Does God also intervene in what in the West would be called salvation process or eschatology? You had described before the process by which morality mediates the afterlife in terms of becoming an ancestor. Is that an automatic process, or is God making a decision in each case how people, what their moral life was like, what level of ancestor they should be? Is it sort of mechanical, or is God making an active decision in the afterlife process?
What's interesting about that is there's no such a thing as a judgment day.
Yeah.
Just maybe to create a context, no such thing as a judgment day.
Right.
It seems that judgment day happens in the context of the community, in the context of the family. It's something that is negotiated there. So what you would find interesting anthropologically and culturally is that decision seems to be one that is done in the human side of things than in the spiritual side of things. Because when the family deems that you have lived a good life, then there are rituals that will be performed to really facilitate the transition into that life. So there will be those kind of, at this level, we are dealing with anthropology, it's really not philosophical. So, but as it seems that it's something that is mediated by the ritual that we perform for you to cross the river or to join people in the sky. It seems that it's something that is determined. And what is being evaluated when that decision is made is your moral conduct. It's your moral conduct. How have you conducted yourself over life? And your community would have observed your life and say, he deserves to be an ancestor. And then that transition is facilitated. And also what's interesting as well is that even those who don't quite qualify, there are ritualistic processes of assisting you. It's not something similar to purgatory, but there's no burning and all of that. The family has to follow particular things for you to be Yeah. So sometimes I would hear families saying, look, I got a dream from our grandfather saying that he's not been accepted, so he's feeling cold. So we have to slaughter a cow for him while we are still fixing his process.
Oh.
So those are interesting anthropological pieces of evidence.
Yeah, no.
But what is interesting to think about the afterlife is just the sense of how involved, how involved the family is, even in that kind of making decisions and what they have at their disposal, which raises serious moral epistemological questions. How do you really know, given that there is that element of the human hiddenness, the problem of the mind, the problem of how do you know, right? How do you know? So there is that problem as well, which is a deep, serious, problem in moral epistemology, which I've always, distanced myself from it.
Yeah, no, that's fascinating. So the family is really part of the salvation process, and if they do it right, they can control how various members are in the afterlife, even on even after they're there, they can still have impact on that. And so basically, God has set up this system so that the family can do this. And so God is not making this judgment that whether it's a judgment day or whatever, that God is doing that. But God set the system so that the family could be involved in the process.
Yes, so that's why I'm saying that one of the things that will be very important in African traditional theology is the centrality of the family. And I think sociologically and philosophically, that those things still need to be worked out. But the family seems to play a very, very important role in that entire process, particularly also with the connection with the spiritual via ancestors and all of that. So it seems that the family is, and this is a very important point, is that even the connection that one has directly with God, you don't have it with any other ancestor. You have it directly with your family. So in a family, so the way you thought about it's the idea that your family becomes your ancestor. So when your father passes away, your mother passed away, they become your ancestor. Your grandfather become your ancestor. It's not your neighbor. It's not, you can't go and say, I'm going to so it runs in the bloodline in that sense. So there's this family orientedness in this thing, family orientedness, but also at the group level, there might be a diviner, there might be a leader who represents the community in terms of vital force as well, and is the one who connects God to the family, to the community to God. But just the human emphasis, the family emphasis, the community emphasis seems to be very central in this process.
Is it fair to ask, in African traditions, what is ultimate reality? And the way we ask that on Close to the Truth is we ask the question, what exists? What are the fundamental, non-reducible categories of reality? And I know you said earlier that God didn't create ex nihilo from nothing, but reformed what was there. So does that mean that in addition to the God category, we have to have the earth or the matter category that are fundamental?
Well, it seems the question of place is inescapable, right? So the question of matter, the question of somewhereness seems essential in African thought. But it's something that has not been explored philosophically, right? What is the nature of this matter and what is its role? Right? But what's important is then when God intervenes in this, it's the deposit he makes of a feature definitive of him of vitality. So that seems to be the thing that really orients the direction, the teleological direction of the world, that more life is so the most important category is that energy, that divine energy that defines the very essence of God, and that also defines everything that exists. And it's very interesting that even even an inanimate object has got that vitality. Plants have got the major difference will be just in terms of degrees. But as a matter of fact, everything has got vitality.
So you've mentioned vitality a number of times, and that's really a fundamental building block to understand African traditional religion. So give me a deeper sense of the epistemology or the ontology of vitality. I mean, is it an abstract object? Is it something that God creates? Is it something that emanates from all living beings? I mean, but you said inanimate objects can also have a sense of vitality.
Yes.
So help me understand vitality.
Look, maybe if I give concrete examples of it, it might make sense.
Yes.
The sense of it. When you go consult a doctor, a traditional doctor, and you are sick,
okay,
the traditional doctor will go get a plant. Get a plant. You are sick means that biologically or even morally your vitality is going down. That is why you are sick. Okay. So your life condition, your vitality is really compromised or challenged. So the use of plants is important because plants have got vitality. So it will be a transfer of vitality in part from the plants to yourself to bring back life to you. So, and this is a very important part because it's got interesting implications. So there's that transfer of vitality from the plant to yourself to restore you back to health, right? Restore you back to health, right? But if the thing that also affected your vitality is the relationship, so relationships become very important because they are one of the enhancers or enablers of the growth of your vitality. So after you are given plans to help you, the doctor will say, bring your family along. Bring your family along, because the broken relationship is the cause of your dwindling vitality. And then, there is that. But to show how ingrained in the psychology of Africans this idea of vitality, a lot of people have never understood why in war situations, women will be raped by soldiers and they will even eat human hearts. So when you look at that behavior without understanding the underlying ontology, you think this is just barbaric, cruel acts. Yes, they're barbaric and cruel, but in part what informs them is the harvesting of another person's vitality.
Wow.
So that they become stronger and powerful. Become stronger and powerful. Let me give you another example. I'm not saying this is right. We deal with this when you do proper moral philosophy in relation to the idea of vitality. So as HIV is very prevalent below the Sahara, particularly in South Africa, one of the leading countries in the world. And a lot of people used to rape infants. They rape infants because they believe it cures them of HIV. But if you look into that belief with a scientific mind, I just think this person is mad. But if you have the idea of vitality, the vitality of a child is still fresh, is still uncorrupted. So the belief is that if I can harvest that vitality, it might restore me back to health. It doesn't work. It just harms the child. But I'm just trying to give you a sense of how ingrained this idea of vitality is. Let me give you one last example. Marikana situation, 38 miners were killed, right? And one of the beliefs was that whatever motive they were given by the person they consulted with had increased their vital force to a point where the bullet will become ineffective when they're shot by the police. We know the aftermath of the massacre, how 38 people were killed in the massacre. So I was just showing you how ingrained this idea is, right? And also, just to help you get this, a person who is well respected is referred to have isithunzi, siriti, or isidima. And these ideas signify the idea of a shadow, that there's a shadow next to you that surrounds you. So this is the idea of vitality. This is the idea of vitality. So So this idea of vitality, it's a very it's an idea that has got these practical implications or these medicinal implications, or these can explain this, because it's an important category in how people frame the world, in how people frame the world. So I just thought I wanted to give. So even God positively is an embodiment of that energy. It's an abstract idea, but there's a sense in which it is practical, right? The sense in which it is practical.
But it's the same vitality that God would have, that is the practical one that is expressed in traditional African religion. It's an expression of the same.
It's the same in kind, yes, the same in kind. The same in kind, different in quantity. So God would have the highest, God would have, yeah, but in kind is the same.
Well, Tamai, I think you have increased my vitality during the last hour. I thank you for that. I don't know if anybody could have done it as well as you have. So I've learned some. I really appreciate your participation. It's extremely important in our project, Global Philosophy of Religion, to have African traditional religion, not necessarily the current religion, which is a lot of Western religion, but the traditional African religion participating its way of thinking. And as I said, my vitality is now increased. So thank you very much.
Yeah, I'm happy as well, because I feel my vibrancy, my energy levels are high, which indicates that my vitality for the past hour has also increased. It was a pleasure. It was a pleasure, and I hope that from here, I'll be working on a paper on the problem of evil. Where I'll be giving an African perspective on that. So there's a lot that's going to be coming. But my strength.
You have an invitation when your paper on the problem of evil in African tradition is done. Let us know, and we'll help you publicize it.
Thank you. I really appreciate that.